one, we got to really understand, does it actually work? Two, is it worth doing? And then three, is it fully aligned with the principles and ethics we've promised to our consumers, and we actually think advances the brand and who we are?
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. Our broadcast today features a panel from our Meta Strategy Summit held on October 29th. And the topic of the conversation is responsible artificial intelligence, value proposition, and opportunities. And the panelists who joined us for the discussion were Ed McLaughlin, the President and Chief Technology Officer of Mastercard, Marina Bellini, the President of Global Business Services at Mars, and John Russell, the Chief Information Officer of Northrop Grumman. The session was moderated by Meta Strategy Partner and East Coast Office Lead, Alex Kraus. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
I think we have established that AI is something that we all aspire to, something that we see and find a lot of business value in, and something that at times is believed to be overhyped. So we want to shift the conversation a little bit and talk not just about the value, but talk about like how to exercise AI responsibly. What we mean by that is developing, deploying, using AI in a way that is transparent, accountable, ethical, legal, sustainable, and the list goes on. And it's really interesting because one could think that, we are focusing on the opposite side of value. But what is interesting, there is research out there that shows there's actually a lot of value in responsible AI. And interestingly, Nitin of Vanguard earlier today said that one of the business cases of AI, he listed a few, is actually risk management and risk mitigation. So we want to talk about that a little bit, talk about the value, but also how to see the relationship between measured risk taking, risk assessment, and then the value of AI. We're going to start with Marina. Marina is a person who is, 10 days into her new job with Mars. She came from a Brazilian bank with 35 billion of revenue. Ed and Marina were just talking about their mutual background as we got ready. And now she's joining a privately held company with $50 billion of revenue, doing anything from confectionery, cat care, food, and other items as well. And she has a lot of depth. And Marina, I want to start with you. And, with all the hype of AI, I want to come back to something we discussed when we prepped for the session today. And then you said, there's so many things that we think about in the context of AI, but some of that is actually just basic data management and processes. So would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. The way we discussed, when the hype of Gen AI starting, landing, now in the bank, was, everybody afraid of hallucinations. And we had to study this a little bit, and we said hallucination is nothing but bad data quality. So this is the dream of the CIOs that now finally people are going to work on that. So because, they're so excited of what we can do with Gen AI, but there's something behind it that we need to take care of. But I think I find a lot of similarities, being in financial services and now a few days back into consumer goods, on this concept that there is no other way other than having a structured framework governing, how to apply or do not apply AI in the organization. And again, just 10 days in, I didn't find anything different than, a very senior group of people with cyber knowledge, with data knowledge, with business knowledge, HR knowledge, getting together and saying, what is the first set of policies and procedures that we want to put in place, knowing that is good enough for the knowledge that we have up to that point in time to get started, but we will continue to evolve, and look back to the principles or the values that you have in your organization, taking that as your starting point. And then from then onwards, you're going to learn from others, you're going to learn from regulators, but we know that we can just not stop the innovation to happen in the organization. And, I think from the beginning, separating what is customer consumer facing, AI versus what is not. There's already a way of distinct how much rigor you need to put into, testing before you put in front of your employee or your customer or consumer. So that gives already, 2 levels of freedom that you can bring into the experimentation. And I think the second thing that governance looks through is how much of human intervention you're still going to have in the process, although you have AI. So put AI to help your customer care analyst to then talk to the customer, it goes wrong, maybe it's just, a little bit better, not super much better than what that analyst would do without AI. But what is the risk to that? That is very different than someone is coming and asking, what about the benefits of these 3 options of loans I may have, or 3 chocolates I may have? And then you're talking to people, financial health or health, and you need another level of scrutiny. So I think having this framework that we acknowledge that is always going to evolve. And again, just going back to the beginning of the conversation, in most of those experimentations, we find ourselves going back to the basics of how to make sure we're feeding AI every time with the best quality. And by the way, AI also helps then the data become better. And again, I think our dream is coming true because the organization is putting energy behind that so that we can truly leverage this technology.
Good, fantastic. Yeah, going back to the basics, and of course, the learning from one another. It's interesting that you mentioned the regulators. If you think about, BIS and Basel is now heavily adopting, as Ed probably knows, things related to fraud detection and other things and so forth. John, talking about having done AI for a while. So Northrop Grumman, you lead the behemoth of an organization across 4 segments: aeronautics, defense, mission, space. And you've done AI for some time.
Yes.
And when we talked, you talked about a little bit following the theme, following standard processes, but doing things just a little bit differently and finding the balance between like innovation, creativity, and being responsible. Can you talk about how you do that?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me. Honored to be part of this team panel and the audience. So from, first of all, setting the stage, there's a very diverse kind of set of markets here. In aerospace and defense, there's just a level of regulation that you have to kind of go through. There are what I call the different ecosystems from that you cannot apply, generative AI across just because you have to compartmentalize. So from our standpoint, we start from where Northrop Grumman's core values are, and that's ethics and integrity. And so we really looked at how do we apply generative AI or AI in general in an ethical way. One of the things we first started, and I first started with, was identifying a chief of ethical technology. That was the first role we actually put into our AI team to really kind of send a message and set the stage for how we're going to apply AI across the company. And then it's also very interesting and a delicate balance because being able to put AI into the products that we make for DoD and aerospace is very much governed by what your customers are willing to accept, what your customers are comfortable validating. And so it's a delicate balance in how you kind of articulate capabilities into our product base, educating our customers, and then looking at the full ecosystem. We look at it from kind of a matrix approach of how we get AI into the hands of each one of our employees, which is very different than how we would apply AI to our products. And then how do you consume it is also, I think, 3 different ways. One is kind of you take what the market gives you, right, kind of out of the box, and you want to apply that as best you can because your best ROI is right there. But then you also have to manage the ethicalness of what you're getting from your third parties. The second is there are capabilities out there that you need to modify because you're not getting exactly what you need. And then last is you're creating from scratch. And so when we look at it from both the fact of how do I enable employees to be more productive, but then how do I get it into a radar or a rocket are very different approaches. And so when you take that and then you integrate the governance and how you want to look at each one of those things, the use cases are very important. So how you look at what use cases you will actually take on and you govern that from a enterprise perspective, allowing you to ensure that it's ethical, it's explainable, and it aligns with your kind of core values is a big step to take.
Wonderful. And how amazing is it? We talk about responsible AI and we talk about ROI. And with ROI, we got to go to the money guy here. Yeah. So Ed, you and Mastercard, you've been at this obviously for a long time as well in many different ways. We'll talk about the business value in a minute, but take us through I believe you employ like a 2-tier evaluation process. And you actually start with something that goes to the AI board before you even get to the technical part. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, really to echo some of the conversations we had earlier, you have to start with the problem you're looking to solve.
Yeah.
And so many times it comes forth like, how can we use this new technique? It's rather than saying, what are the hard problems that you could never solve before? And will this allow you to do that? So quite simply, you got to start with, does it work? And then, is it worth it? And then you get to, should we do it? And I think collectively, what we're representing in this room, it's our job in the organization in a new way, where there's always been the things that people don't know what they're talking about, want to talk about. And we can go back to blockchain. I always say that I think the greatest thing that ChatGPT did for us is we got to stop talking about the metaverse, right? We at least changed the conversations for that. So when I look at, we talked about this earlier, like loose models or weak models, right? One of the things I don't think human in the loop works because they're humans, right? The HCI, the human computer interaction that we have to design around these systems isn't necessarily just the capability of the systems, but the interface to the people. So if you're going to provide something to a customer service rep, don't give them one option, they'll wave it through. Make them pick from 3, so they have to judge the accuracy. In security solutions, unless you're sending a false positive through to salt it to see whether or not they're paying attention, the humans will drop out of the loop. So one of the rules we have is, the opposite of artificial intelligence is natural stupidity, and that's equally powerful, and you have to be ready for that. So our job as technologists is to truly understand what that state of the art is, not what the hype or potential may be. I think the second big part of that job is it worth it? ChatGPT search response is about 10 times more expensive than a Google response. The real question is, can you monetize it 12 times more or not? And that's what we're seeing. I think we're all learning it's punishingly expensive to run deep inference models at the production speeds that we have to. So we've always taken a mixture of expert approach of saying, what's the right technique? What's the right AI? What's the right way of solving the problem you're looking for? So 1, does it work well enough? Do you have the right controls around it? 2, is it something which is, again, the responsibility, something which will work well in the production speeds that you want, that there's a return on what you're doing? And then the foundation of all of that, if you have those 2 elements, is our responsibility to do it. And I loved how you talked about ethics. I don't think ethics impedes innovation in any way. The innovation needs to support your ethics. So the only AI in our shop is responsible AI. And we say, what is the data that we have stewardship with? We published, I would again encourage your organization to think about doing the same if you're consumer facing. We actually published years ago a consumer bill of rights or set of data rights to say that you have the right to know what data we have. We will only use the data we get from you to make the products and services you get from us better. Everyone loves us stopping fraud, right? And I think for all of our brands that are based on trust, leading with those ethics and then using it to judge how we apply these powerful new techniques. So 1, we got to really understand, does it actually work? 2, is it worth doing? And then 3, is it fully aligned with the principles and ethics we've promised to our consumers? And we actually think advances the brand and who we are. So we have a review panel that can look at those usages. There's conversations earlier about several 100,000 flowers bloom. I think we're all subject to that. I think it's too easy and too accessible for people to work on those things. So I think the 2 big guardrails we have to have is 1 is the access to the data, right? The real data, the real production data and things like that, and understanding the lineage and provenance of that. And then the separation of duty of what gets into production. So you can allow all kinds of experimentation to flourish, but until you use it in anger, that's where you have to have real controls.
That's great. And not surprising, you were in your 18 years at Mastercard in a product role. So you clearly speak like a technologist with a product front and center. So that's
the point is always what's it for.
Yeah, it's great. Let's shift a little bit to the kind of the business value that's in responsible AI. And there's lots of studies out there that make the connection as well. I think our friends at Bain recently published something that if you invest in AI while being responsible, you are twice as likely to harvest twice of the profits. Okay, I haven't validated the data, but it's an interesting data point. So, John, if you think about that, and if you think about like the value that you deliver to your customers, but also the people using your products, like how do you factor that into the risk reward trade-off and responsible AI?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So I'll share kind of a anecdote that I tend to think about when my team is looking to kind of drive innovation. So Northrop is a very mission-focused company. So we want to get technology capability in the hands of our servicemen and women so we bring them home safely. And so you can imagine the frustration is that because we're highly regulated and we're using the ethical approach, that our nation states that may not be using those, they have an advantage. So I use the analogy of thinking about, okay, you have to play, I'm gonna use a golf analogy, you have to play against your competitor. He's got a full bag, you got 3 clubs. But you have to be just as good with those 3 clubs as they are with their whole bag, right? And the translation is they have the whole breadth of capability and not have to be constrained by it, whereas we have to play and get better at it with just the tools that we have. And so from that vantage point, we have to really excel within the constraints we have, within the ethical constraints. And quite honestly, that'll make us better at it, right? Because if you know how to manipulate and maneuver through the regulation, the ethics to the point of explainability, data, once you get through those hurdles, you can then truly innovate in the most repeatable, safe way. I think that overall, it is a point of now it is just the beginning of that race, and we're all trying to work through that. So we have to be smart about the things that we want to apply that resource and that learning to. And I 100% agree is you need to understand, can you be successful? I think the other thing that is really critical for us is, much like many of my colleagues here, we've been in AI for a long time. You can look at the pattern of any technology disruption. If you go back to cloud, people thought cloud was going to disrupt the world. It was going to be dangerous. They were going to take jobs. There's a pattern, right? You figure out how to harness that, both potential and fear, and then manage through it, right? And so for us and for me, it really is helping the team understand that applying generative AI to everything is not the answer, right? So if you have the right data, you have proven techniques of just AI ML that could be much more efficient in driving it and reliable. And so it's a balance. It is another tool in the toolbox, not the answer to every question. And so often when technology disruption happens, it's a hammer looking for a nail. Everyone wants to put it there. And so as leaders, from an ethical standpoint and business leaders, we have to kind of be able to decipher and help the teams figure out whether the right application of the technology is this particular use case.
That's great. And John, you mentioned the balance. And Marina, I want to come back to you and have you talk a little bit about the balance and how to strike the balance, because it is not easy. So you need to know your organization's strategy. You need to understand your organization's risk posture generally. But then when we discussed it, you rightly said, hey, it's not as simple as that. You need to be more specific. Can you talk a little bit about like how to think about use cases and how they all have the different risk profile and how you need to see the value for each use case in the context of risk and mitigating that?
And I love what my colleague said, because I don't know how many times we use the word value, right? And that's what we need to be aiming for when people come to the Responsible AI, committee or a working group, say, I would like to do this. First question, usually is, I want to use Gen AI for this. I said, like, okay, tell me, what are you trying to do? What is the process that you are looking into? And in several cases, it goes back to the solution that has nothing to do with AI. To your point, maybe, simple RPA process reengineering, basic. But sometimes, of course, AI, Gen AI comes into play. But going through this exercise of looking to the process you're looking for value to be generated and not a specific task. And sometimes sharing, cases where in the past people came with this, it is this piece of technology that I'm going to use. I don't really care. Just tell me it's okay. Look to the risks that I need to mitigate. And then you do it, and then you don't get the value out of it. So I think first thing that has helped the governance was really looking to process, end to end, and finding, the combination of solutions, people, process, technology, data that will potentially lead to the value that you're going to experiment. I think this is one. The second thing is always, some people come and say, oh, but my product is different. My client is different. my process is different. And not really. I'm summarizing a legal document. I'm summarizing a customer document. Summarizing. Well, that's what we were talking about. Or I'm translating, or I'm creating, or I'm suggesting. So really trying to think on AI on modules that the organization then can, learn faster, look to the risks we need to mitigate in the data, in the technology, in the partners we work with, and replicating. I think this idea that, we're all here in big organizations, right, that everything people are trying to do is completely different. It is kind of the opposite of innovation, where it starts, mine is different, I'm going to really innovate. If you can copy 80% of, a piece of a model that someone else in an organization thought you had nothing to do with, but is the same functionality, you're going to accelerate the process. So if it is, creating, a better engagement with our brands, if it is making our manufacturing sites more efficient, if it's about making our back office process, with lower risk. And we have cases, I don't know if some of you have seen, there was a recent sneakers campaign, with consumer specific generated videos on Gen AI, or with Jose Mourinho from our coach. And everything that went behind that to make sure that whatever content was going to be created would be, of course, responsible in front of the consumer and representing the values of Mars. And then every brand is different because, I'm not a sneakers. I am, Royal Canin. And yeah, but you're just doing the same. You're trying to create content, to a customer or consumer of yours. So I think making sure that this framework that we create in the organization, we allow for repeatability on the things that go right and do not repeat things that go wrong, then they seem different. So I think this just helps accelerate experimentation. But back to it, it's a process. It's a value that we are trying to capture for the organization. Is not a technology we are trying to implement.
It's great that you come back to that. And Ed, thinking about that, you went on the record not too long ago and said, if it doesn't scale, let's not bother. Scale matters. Obviously, with scalability and scaling comes a different risk profile. And I thought something that you do at Mastercard is really interesting. You do something that's called, I think, the silent mode validation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And maybe a few thoughts there. And one of which, John, just to extend the conversation, there's a line from Ed Fandry at Princeton I'm a big fan of, where he says, if it's explainable, it's not AI. And I think one of the things that we all have to learn, if you're doing it at scale, this is very different from managing code, particularly if you have external foundational models or other things of that nature. So one, we run on our own models, on our own data. We have what we call our decision management platform, which is a 1.6 trillion parameter sort of AI brain that runs in our transaction stream. And the model we've always taken is, I'll call it a mixture of experts. We have about 14 different techniques we use within it. Mm-hmm. So it is really fun with all the fascination with generative AI. I remember we were putting up one we called it DI Pro, Decision Intelligence Pro. 20% better fraud detection in certain sectors, 80% reduction in false positives. And everyone wanted to, is it generative? And you're like, well, it's a recurrent neural network, which is kind of a generative technique. Then everyone was happy because it was generative, so we could move forward with the conversation. But it gets back to the question of responsibility and, value and being able to do it repeatably at scale. So we're making decisions that can block someone's transactions, we're making decisions around whether or not a merchant's going to get paid. We have to make those decisions in 50 milliseconds or less. So what we developed was a model where we can run in what we call silent or parallel mode. So we'll look at the current models we have out there. We'll be able to test and validate new models as they come on, and then we make the decision of whether or not we want to cut over from one to another. And I think because you can't treat it as code, it's not a barn raising. It's more like animal husbandry. Like, how do you maintain and how do you manage these models? So the ability to run in silent mode, the ability to constantly and externally measure the efficacy of the models you already have out there. We have a real problem at times with concept drift, where when you train on a certain fraud pattern and you start blocking it, the fraudsters, being very, very smart, will shift their patterns. It can actually destabilize your underlying model. So this whole idea of active maintenance of the models at scale in real speed is both silent mode to validate, is this better or not? Because you can't know until you actually see the observed behavior of it at scale in production. And then the ability to also monitor for things like drift in the models you've already put out there as underlying may change. So while particularly in straight up machine learning and other things, is there is a lot of explainability. But I also think you need to build observability in as an equivalent to the explainability you may hope to have.
Excellent. John, when we talked about this trade-off, you said something that is so simple yet so profound. You said, as always, we don't need to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Okay.
In a business like yours, where the mission is
in missiles.
Yeah, I was going to say in an industry that John explained so well, it's like beyond many of our imaginations. But how do you keep yourself, but also your business partners honest, and how do you find that balance to have the right amount of experimentation and education, constant learning, but keeping the checks and balances in place?
First of all, it's a journey. And to your point, mission is very different than enterprise. So we definitely look at those differently. I think it's a risk-based approach, right? So we look at it in three kind of windows. I seem to have these kind of analogies, but one is the business risk, right? So what is the business risk to this use case, the business value to the use case? We have cyber risk, and then we have a legal risk, right? And so what we're seeing right now is kind of unprecedented with what's happening with regulations. From a cyber standpoint, we see SEC actually prosecuting CISOs now. And so we really do actively manage that whole process between what's the kind of business risk, cyber risk, and the legal risk. And our legal team is also, I have to often kind of get them to, how do I get to yes versus, because you could easily kind of say no to everything and it's too much risk. And so there's a very delicate kind of balance into, one, you can't just say no without a path to yes, right? Really being honest with yourself about the value that my colleagues here have said, but also what is the business opportunity that you're going after? Is it a true opportunity or not? And then really kind of putting all those pieces together, I think, is really how you drive forward.
Good. John, you used the term unprecedented.
Yeah.
And I want to come to something that I think is unprecedented. And you are in a unique situation where, Department of Defense, intel agencies are your customers. But interestingly, last week, we had the White House come out with a new executive order that actually kind of further blurs the line between private sector and public sector. I want to put in the last minutes we have the question to both of you. So the order, roughly my interpretation, says that all chips, NVIDIA and so forth, but also large language models are now considered national assets. And therefore, Intel and defense needs to protect them. As private sector representatives, how do you deal with something like that? How do you take advantage of that? But what concerns do you have?
I'm happy to dive in on that one. I think there's two interesting things that are going on. And I do worry about suppression or restriction on technology because I just don't think it works. There's now, because of what the current U.S. administration has done to suppress advanced chips going into China, there is an explosion of research. And I encourage you to check it out in lightweight, very effective AI modeling, right? Those problems will be solved. So I think these giant dinosaur burning GPU farms that we're talking about will actually be, that's not the end of history. That's the current state of the technology. I think it will be supplanted. So anytime you try to clamp down on something else, science finds a way, right? Nature finds a way. So I am worried about the restrictions that we're putting on this. Now, I do think it's essential assets. I think we need to be very rigorous in the governance we have around it, but I don't think trying to draw borderlines, my personal opinion, is going to work that well on it. Now, we serve at the oversight of every geography we're in. We're in 210 regulatory designations right now. So obviously, we serve at the pleasure of the regulators and make sure we adhere to that. Gets back to the responsibility and ethics. But I think what's happening, maybe just one quick thought on this one, we haven't resolved certain things as civil society. I think a lot of what we would consider something like privacy is actually just obscurity. And now that we can do things at a scale we never could before, right? You were comfortable going to a police precinct and flipping through the local mugshots if you got jumped. We don't like facial recognition of everyone coming out of the airport. The only difference is scale.
Yeah.
So I do think it's important that we resolve certain elements of, as a societal level, what the principles are that we want to hold to. And there's going to be different clubs and different bags in countries around the world. It will play differently in China. But I think we need to understand what our principles are so we can adhere to it. and stop trying to legislate practice, because that's just looking at a current technology in a current state of time. And I think that will always be advancing. And if we don't know what our principles are, we don't know what our ethical grounding and the moral responsibilities we have on that.
That's good.
So while I understand the intent, personally speaking, I think it may be a little misguided if we think restricting the technology is actually going to answer the fundamental question we're trying to go after.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. And Marina, just in the last seconds we have, quickly, your international perspective, professionally, personally, and otherwise, how do we need to think across borders, as Ed said, when it comes to these?
I think for each enterprise is, going back to your company's principles and how you're going to put that to life. Global organizations, especially, you're going to have to comply to different local regulations. But what are the principles that you want to adhere to, that you choose to be the ones for your own company? And then what is it that you're doing in the end for your employees, for your customers, that make them safer, to do their job as you learn the technology, again, individually as a company and collectively as partners we are here. Because in the end, we want to make sure that, there is less and less, biased decision being brought into the data. There's more safety that is being brought to the process that is going through this data, that, of course, nothing unethical is happening there. So bring this safety to your employees, to your customers, no doubt respecting local regulations, but going back to the principles. And Mars, that's one of the things that, is front and center of the discussions of the Responsible AI Committee, because that's the answer that you can only give, to yourself as an organization. And it's not something just written on the wall, especially in times where we're learning so much about a new technology and regulation is coming and going, as they also learn in this process. I think sticking to what it's core for you. It helps this transition that you're always facing with any new technology.
I can just double down on that, because ethics are not situational. And that's what we need to do for our organizations, right? There'll be lots of regulation that we will adhere to the regulations, but who we are and how we choose to use this essential new technology, that's the key. That is the culture of your company. I could not agree with you more on that.
The only thing I will say is oftentimes these executive orders become in place because the government understands there's an imminent threat that we may not all be aware of, right? And so while you have to grant sincerity that it may be a swing too far of the pendulum, but they're doing that in the spirit of protecting critical assets that we don't want in the hands of others. So I'll end on that note.
Complex and so much more to discuss, but thank you for being patient and for explaining all of that. Thank you, my panel. Certainly something, and again, value and responsible AI are not separate conversations. It is the same conversation, and I'm very happy that we dug into this a little bit deeper.